Hello there, I'm Helena Cobban. I'm the president of Just World Educational, a small nonprofit located in Washington, D.C., in the traditional lands of the Piscataways. Today is June 22nd, 2022. It's a big day for a number of reasons. Today in Vienna, the states parties to the 2017 Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons wrapped up their first ever formal meeting. We await the news on what decisions they made, but we definitely send them and also the great global civil society network ICANN that has pushed, prodded, and supported their efforts all along, all our best wishes. Here's to a total global ban on nuclear weapons. Another reason it's a big day is because we have a fabulous expert guest with us on today's webinar, with whom we'll be discussing Israel's very well-developed nuclear arsenal and its effects on so many aspects of global politics, on Israel's relationship with the United States, on all the global nuclear non-proliferation efforts since the 1960s, and on the security of the whole West Asian region that some people like to refer to as the Middle East. Our guest is William B. Quandt, a veteran expert in the affairs of that region who served as the Middle East specialist in the White House under both President Richard Nixon and later President Jimmy Carter. Bill Quandt is also a researcher, a great writer, and a retired university professor. He has written numerous great books about the region and its diplomacy, including Camp David, Peacemaking and Politics, and Peace Process, American Diplomacy and the Arab-Israeli Conflict since 1967. From his perch in the White House during those two stints, and from his in-depth researches in the archives, Bill Quandt has a uniquely well-informed perspective on several key aspects of the political dimension of Israel's stealthily acquired nuclear arsenal that he will share with us today. Full disclosure, Bill and I have been married for 38 years. These issues are things we have often discussed over the dinner table, often to the intense impatience of our children. Anyway, Bill, it's great to have you on our webinar today.
Well, thank you.
This is the sixth public conversation we've held in this series. You can see the records of the previous 5 if you follow the link that is prominently on the homepage of our website, www.justworldeducational.org, or you can get there by going to here. If you follow that link, you will also learn more about the upcoming session in this series, our last session, which starts at noon Eastern Time on Saturday. Our guest then will be Tom Unterreiner, who's the chair of Britain's Veteran Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, and he also runs Europeans for Nuclear Disarmament. Tom has been in Vienna for the ICANN and TPNW meetings, so we'll look forward to a great rundown from him on what's been happening there. In today's session, we'll be looking at the unique role that Israel has played in the worldwide proliferation of nuclear weapons. This is a topic that has very frequently been obfuscated or ignored by the corporate media, which has certainly, along with many other members of the political elite here in the United States, played a very dishonest role in helping to cover up the realities of Israel's nuclear weapons program. This, as it happens, is something that I've written quite a bit about over the years. So we're going to switch our format a bit today. Our main presentation will have 3 segments. In the first, our excellent project manager, Amelle Zeroug, will be asking me a few basic questions about how and when Israel developed its nuclear arsenal. Then, in the second segment, Amelle will hand the interviewer's mic over to me, and I'll ask Bill Quandt some questions about his extremely important areas of expertise. Amelle will be dropping some handy links into the chat box during that segment. Then, in the third segment, I'll give the interviewer's mic back to Amelle, and she will throw out a last tranche of questions that either Bill or I can answer. And after that third segment, We will have opportunities for Q&A. If you'd like to ask a question at that point, please put it in the Q&A box. So now over to you, Amelle. Please grill me mercilessly.
Thank you, Helena. I'm going to start us off by asking, when did Israel start its work on its own nuclear weapons?
So very soon, actually, after the Nakba and after the creation of the State of Israel, the first Prime Minister, David Ben-Gurion, was very eager. You know, they had just seen the power that the United States got from its detonation, its dropping of 2 bombs over Hiroshima and Nagasaki. And I think he was interested from the get-go, and his main person that he put onto the case to work on this was Shimon Peres, which is interesting because most people in the West think of Shimon Peres as Mr. Peace, and not so many people understand his role in putting together the many aspects that allowed Israel to get its nuclear arsenal. So the main thing that helped them was that the French were also eager to get their own nuclear arsenal in those years, let's say the early 50s, because the Russians had, obviously the Americans showed their nuclear capabilities in 1945. The Russians did so in 1949 by some detonations. And then the French wanted to have a kind of an independent, they called it force de frappe. They thought, and the head of their atomic weapons agency, François Perrin, said that it's going to be really important to have nuclear weapons, to have a nuclear arsenal if you want to be a big power in the world today. So long story short, in 1956, the French and the British and the Israelis connived in that thing called the trilateral attack against Egypt. And Eisenhower, interestingly, forced them back. I mean, he forced the Israelis to go home, and he forced the English and the French to go out of Sinai, and Sinai was restored to the Egyptians. And the French and the English and the Israelis were really mad about that. And that was the point at which the French said to the Israelis, oh, we'll work with you on getting your own independent force de frappe. And so they started from then on. So that's how, kind of when it really started in earnest.
You've mentioned the French. Which other outside parties helped, bring about the Israeli nuclear? Yeah.
So it was mainly the French, but also Norway, which allowed or sent some heavy water to Israel, which was an essential thing later as they were developing tritium and the components for a thermonuclear weapon. The United States, there was definitely considerable leakage of nuclear material from a processing plant in Philadelphia that, the governmental authorities turned a sort of a blind eye to. And then at some point, and certainly later on, South Africa, apartheid South Africa was a big ally in the Israeli quest for a nuclear weapon. In fact, the one time when there was almost certainly an Israeli nuclear explosion was in the South Atlantic, and that was in cooperation with the apartheid South Africa regime, and it was done, I believe, with an Israeli weapon off a South African boat. That was in 1979. So
is that the only time that Israel tested a nuclear weapon? Did I understand that correctly? Or
yeah, I mean, that's the only. The CIA picked it up through satellite imagery, and actually Dick Helms, who was the head of the CIA, I think at the time, or maybe he told me that he was pretty certain that it was an Israeli nuclear weapon, and everybody works on that assumption. Now, yes, the only time there was a test.
Mm-hmm. And so what means does Israel have to deliver a nuclear strike?
You know, they have planes, fighter planes. Right now they have F-35s that are very generously given to them by you and me and everybody else who's a US taxpayer. They have missiles, and they also have nuclear capable submarines that have been most recently given to them and refurbished by Germany.
Okay, scary. Huh. And what were the revelations rather that Mordecai Vanunu made in 1986? Can you speak to that a little bit?
Yeah, so Mordecai Vanunu is a very interesting person. He was taken to Israel at age 10 from Morocco, where he was, I think he was born about 1952. And so he went with his Jewish family, quite a large family, many siblings, and they were settled in one of these resettlement towns in the south of Israel. And he ended up working at Dimona, which is the main Israeli nuclear facility. And along the way, I mean, if you go to his Wikipedia page, you can get quite a good picture of his life and the reasons that he became a whistleblower. So in 1985 or 86, he left Dimona, but before he left, he took pictures, photographs of many key items of the installation there. And he ended up in Australia. He converted to Christianity, and he contacted the Sunday Times of London and offered to share with them both the photographs and the technical details, of which he had many. And they were persuaded, and everybody who read his revelations was persuaded, and this was all certified by good experts like Frank Barnaby, that actually Israel's nuclear weapons program was considerably more advanced than anybody had thought until then, including that it had an apparently well-developed thermonuclear weapons capability and had actually generated enough weapons grade plutonium and uranium to produce something like 10 nuclear weapons per year. Well, you know, by that time they first put together something that could be recognized or could be put together sort of IKEA style as a nuclear weapon in 67. So by that time they'd been doing it for 20 years. So people at that point said, well, maybe they have like 200 weapons. Some people have put the number up to 400. Some people bring it down to 80, but it's anyway, a considerable and significant arsenal of weapons of quite advanced capability and destructive power.
Did these revelations make any difference in the ways in which the US or other parties treated Israel?
Really not. I mean, you know, here in this country, you know, there's, by that time, 86, there was such a massive, you know, just ingrained multi-decade support for Israel in the political elite, in Congress, and to a large extent in the executive branch as well, that people said, oh, well, there were kind of two responses when Vanunu's revelations came out. One was, oh, it's nothing new. We knew all that, you know, it's not important, which is a stunning response. And the other was, oh, well, we'll have to look at this more in greater depth. Now, the sad thing about Mordecai Vanunu is that the Mossad actually trapped him. They lured him to Italy, and they kidnapped him from a boat in Italy, and they took him back to Israel, and they sentenced him to 18 years in prison, which he served. And then after they released him, he's still living in Jerusalem. He lives, I believe, in the Anglican Cathedral in Jerusalem, but he's not allowed to talk to journalists. He's not allowed to talk to foreigners. And if he does, then they haul him in and put him in jail again for another 6 months or a year. And he's been married for a while. I mean, his situation is very similar to that of Julian Assange, you have to say. Anyway, we can talk more about that.
Well,
so I guess that's
thank
it.
you, Helena. Yeah, I'll let you take it away.
Okay. Right, so now I am going to turn to our wonderful guest expert, Bill Quandt. Bill, it's good to have you with us. You're in one room in the apartment and I'm in another, and we'll talk to each other as though we are just very serious, because we are very serious. This is a very serious topic. So, okay, my first question, Bill, you are an amazing expert in US decision-making. So I'm going to structure many of my questions to you around the various post-1945 presidencies that you've studied closely. What can you tell us about the eras of the Eisenhower and JFK presidencies and the attitudes of both of those to Israel's emerging nuclear weapons program?
Well, it's hard for Americans today, when we have such a close and almost unquestioning relationship with Israel, to remember that in the first 20 years of Israel's existence, the United States was rather standoffish. For example, we did not initially, although we recognized Israel's existence after 1948, 49, and had diplomatic relations, we did not provide military support. In fact, we were at that time trying to arrange an agreement that would keep weapons from both Russia and the Soviet Union and the United States and Europe from going to the Middle East. That, of course, didn't last indefinitely, but Eisenhower in particular, as president, had a rather distant relationship with the Israelis. I wouldn't say that he was anti-Israeli, but when the Israelis went to war in 1956 with the British and the French, the Sinai operation, Eisenhower was really annoyed, partly because they had not told him in advance. And the United States had given diplomatic support to the Israelis, but at this crucial moment, they didn't let the United States know what their plans were. And so he responded by forcing the Israelis to back down and to evacuate Sinai. And it was the remainder of the Eisenhower period was one in which the relationship never really warmed up. When Kennedy came along, because he was a Democrat and the Democrats in those days were viewed as being more sympathetic to the Israelis, it was expected that things might change. But Kennedy had a particular interest in trying to promote the so-called non-proliferation, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the NPT. And so at this point, the Israelis had not yet developed a nuclear weapon, but they had a nuclear program. And so Kennedy was eager to get them to sign on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. And so he spent a fair amount of his time in communicating with the Israelis to try to persuade them to sign on and to allow American inspectors to look at the Dimona reactor to see if it was in fact a peaceful reactor or whether it had a weapons program associated with it. During the Kennedy period, inspections never began, but the dialogue was fairly sustained and at a high level where Kennedy kept pressing for it. He also was reluctant to end the ban on American weapons going to Israel, but toward the end of his presidency, he did agree to supply so-called Hawk missile defenses, because at that point, it was believed that the Russians were giving the Egyptians ground-to-ground missiles and air capabilities that could threaten the Israelis. So these were viewed as defensive weapons, and Kennedy did give the green light to the first significant arms sales to Israel without getting a quid pro quo on the NPT. So when Johnson becomes president, he inherits these kind of unresolved issues of what to do about the request for the NPT signature and future arms sales.
So Johnson's presidency included the 1967 Israeli-Arab War. So first of all, if you could just quickly tell us what happened with the inspections that happened under Johnson, but only for a little period. And then obviously the 1967 war and how nuclear realities may have figured in there. Right.
Inspections were permitted by the Israelis beginning in 1964, and there were several rounds of inspections. We now know that the Israelis very carefully walled off the significant weapons operation part of Dimona, was all underground, and those areas were sealed off. So the Americans were allowed to see the benign part of Dimona, and they knew that there was no evidence from that there was any weapons operation going on. But they also weren't sure that they were being given full access, which we now know were not. Johnson was much more sympathetic to the Israelis, as he had been in the Senate for a long time, and during his time in the Senate, he had opposed Eisenhower's decision to force the Israelis out of Sinai in 1956. So he already had a posture that was more sympathetic, but he also tried to get the Israelis to accept the idea that if we were going to give them additional weapons, he was open to the idea of it, they should at least announce that they had no plans to develop nuclear weapons of their own, and at some point they should sign on to the Non-Proliferation Treaty. But he didn't push it very hard. This was the time by 1967, 66, 67, that Johnson was getting more and more preoccupied with Vietnam. And so politically, he wasn't eager to make enemies in Congress as he was trying to mobilize support for an unpopular engagement in Vietnam. Now, the 1967 war comes about at a very interesting time. US-Egyptian relations have deteriorated over primarily Egypt's role in Yemen. The crisis leading up to the 67 war seems to kind of come out of almost nowhere, catches people by surprise. They're not really prepared for it. It also comes at a very interesting time in terms of Israel's nuclear program, as we now know. They were very close in the early part of 1967 to having the elements of an operational weapon available, but they hadn't yet probably assembled it, but they started rushing to complete the assembly of at least a couple of rudimentary warheads in the spring of 1977. We weren't sure of that.
Hang on,
67.
It's 67.
67. We weren't sure of that. The American intelligence was not great, but they knew the Israelis had a program going. They just didn't know how far along it was. So coming to 1967, I'll try to make this brief. It has usually been thought that nuclear weapons had nothing to do with the 1967 war, and that is largely true. But the caveat on that is that the Egyptians, and probably the Russians, just like us, knew that Dimona was more than just a shoe factory or a benign nuclear energy producer, and suspected that they were producing nuclear weapons there. The Egyptians had, in fact, carried out in May, just the month before the war broke out, several weeks before the war broke out in June 1967, had carried out several reconnaissance flights over Dimona. Once they entered Israeli airspace, they could take photographs of Dimona, and they were out of Israeli airspace in 3 or 4 minutes and would be over Jordan and then come back and land in Egypt. And so the Israelis could not prevent them from looking at the target and fine-tuning their information about this as a potential target. So by the middle of May, as the crisis between Egypt and Israel was growing, that led eventually to the 1967 war, the Israelis became, I would say, almost paranoid that if war happens, the Egyptians are going to strike at Dimona. And knowing what they knew about what was at Dimona, this could be very bad for them if it blew up the facility and spread around nuclear material. And so you begin to see in communications, including with the United States, and I have one very important document where the head of Israeli intelligence tells the American head of intelligence that war is probably going to happen soon, and that Israel cannot wait for much longer because they know that if the Egyptians strike first, they will strike at Dimona, and Israel can't allow that to happen. And he ends by saying, I think within the next couple of days, we're going to have to act to prevent that. So that, to my mind, is the first indication we have that the presence of nuclear weapons, rather than making war less likely, makes the Israelis feel they have to preempt so they avoid having their own target hit. And the Egyptians know that there is this target and they're tempted to strike it. And it raises the temperature in the week or two before the war breaks out on June 6, 1967, immeasurably. Now, as the war unfolds, nuclear weapons play no role. The Israelis never threatened them. They didn't really have much in the way of capability, and the war was virtually over within the first 48 hours in any case.
Wow, that is so interesting. And I think Amelle has dropped into the chat the link to that document that you found.
This is Richard Helm's memo to the president, in which he mentions that Dimona was razed.
Right. Raised R-A-I-S-E-D,
Right.
not R-A-Z-E-D. Okay,
Right.
so after LBJ, we had Richard Nixon, whose presidency started in 1969 and also encompassed the October 1973 Israeli-Arab War. So what can you tell us about the attitudes and policies that Nixon and his ever wily national security advisor, Dr. Henry Kissinger, about the attitudes and policies that they adopted toward Israel's nuclear weapons program?
For the first year or so, Kissinger didn't actually play much of a role on the Middle East. Nixon didn't entirely trust his views on the Middle East, partly because he was Jewish, and Nixon actually said that. So the State Department was more in charge of Middle East policy. Kissinger was dealing with very important issues. The opening toward China was being discussed, the Vietnam War was being discussed, and relations with Russia. So he had a full portfolio, but his views on the Middle East had not yet fully developed. And Nixon actually had some views on the Middle East, and they, by our standards today, he would be viewed as relatively more even-handed in his views between Arabs and Israelis than most presidents have been since then. So in the early part of his presidency, the State Department urges him to revive this kind of unresolved issue of Israel signing the Non-Proliferation Treaty, and if necessary, to use some pressure over arms transfers to get them to do so. Say, we won't sell you advanced aircraft unless you commit yourself to the NPT, at least at some point in the future. So a dialogue goes on with their ambassador, who happens to be Yitzhak Rabin, who's very close to Golda Meir, who's the prime minister at this point. And he tries out all kinds of formulations. And he says, could we simply agree that Israel will say, we will not be the first to introduce nuclear weapons into the Middle East? Would that satisfy you? And so that's then discussed at some length. And then people say, well, what does that mean? We won't introduce them. Does that mean they won't physically be there? Or does it mean you won't stand up and announce them? But it begins the discussion of what would you be prepared to say, what would you be prepared to do, and what would our quid pro quo be? So in September of 1969, Nixon meets alone with Golda Meir in the United States. Nobody else is present. There is no record of the meeting, but we know, at least from Nixon's account and the Israeli accounts, what they agreed upon. And basically, Nixon said, we know the inspections didn't produce anything. We're not going to press you for inspections. That didn't work. We do not want you to introduce physically nuclear weapons into the area. We know you've used this term. We want that to mean you will not produce and you will not flaunt any capabilities you have. So you won't announce them, you won't threaten to use them, and you won't test them. And that's, if you agree to all of that, we could accept that we will just keep our mouths shut. We won't badger you about it. We will kind of leave it for later, but we're not done with this discussion, but that will get you through the next year or two. And Nixon didn't say this, but probably, and get me through my next election without having to confront a big argument over Israel and the NPT. So that pretty much ends the public dialogue. There is some continued discussion about what does this term will not be the first to introduce weapons. But then, there's no immediate test. There is a crisis in Jordan in 1970, but there's no Arab-Israeli war. And Kissinger does begin to get more influence in 1972, and then by 73, he's actually Secretary of State as well. And his view is that as long as Israel is kept strong with conventional weapons, which it was, first, there won't be an Arab-Israeli war because deterrence will work. He was a strategist and he thought that nuclear weapons helped produce deterrence. And secondly, that if war did break out, Israel would win again in a matter of days, just like it had in 1967. So he was fairly confident that the situation, even if tense, was not explosive. And then, of course, in 1973, Sadat began to give signals that he was getting frustrated. He actually ended up getting his national security advisor to meet with Kissinger on 2 occasions and to tell him, time is running out. This was in 1973. We can't wait forever. You've been fobbing us off with all these statements that you're going to get around to it, but there's always Vietnam, or there's China, or there's Russia, or there's somebody who's more important than we are. We are getting fed up. And by the middle of 1973, there is a real sense that, maybe things need to be re-examined. I was then working for Kissinger and was looking at the evidence, and there was a dialogue that went on between the United States and Egypt, but you could sense that Sadat was getting more and more frustrated. So fast forward, war breaks out with an Egyptian-Syrian surprise attack on a nuclear power, on Israel. And that's not supposed to happen. You're not supposed to have non-nuclear powers going to war with a nuclear power. I'll talk later about perhaps why that happened. But in any case, the war catches us somewhat by surprise. The timing of it certainly was a surprise, catches the Israelis by surprise. And in the first couple of days, I think it is fair to say that some highly placed Israelis, particularly the new Minister of Defense, Moshe Dayan, really panicked. He thought, we are at risk of being overrun. The Syrians were making fast advances on the Golan front. Remember, this was a 2-front attack, and the Egyptians had crossed the Suez Canal, which was supposed to be a barrier that they couldn't get across. And so there is some reason to believe, although the evidence on this is not crystal clear by any means, that Dayan, maybe on the second day or so, proposed in a restricted cabinet meeting to Golda Meir that perhaps the way to stop the Egyptians and the Syrians in their tracks is to do a demonstrative nuclear explosion somewhere, maybe in the Sinai or in the Golan Heights. Not as a military, to destroy troops, but to show we've got the bomb and we can use it. And there's no record of that cabinet meeting, of that happening, but there are people who say that he did raise the issue, and Golda basically cut off the conversation at that point as if this is not the time to discuss it. My recollection, and I knew nothing about that at the time, from about the next day or so, was that on October 8th or 9th, this would have been the second or third day of the war, I remember seeing a fragment of intelligence, and I was pretty well plugged in, that said the Israelis had raised the alert status of their missiles, the so-called Jericho missiles, which some questions whether they were actually operational or they were just sort of showing that they had them. But if they did have them and if they were operational, it made no sense for them to put a conventional warhead on them. They had an air force that was very effective and was bombing like crazy. But I remember thinking, if they're doing that to get our attention, they got my attention, because that means they're trying to signal that they've got a nuclear capability that they could put on a Jericho missile. And if anybody has any illusions that this will end, happily, if they're on the verge of being defeated, think again. But so much else was going on. Frankly, nobody else remembers seeing that. The document has never been found. I'm still sure that I saw it. And Israelis with whom I have talked, who would be in the know, say it probably was a test that was ordered by Dayan, not necessarily by the cabinet, just in case the decision was made to up the ante. And so that was my first thought, that there is a nuclear shadow over this crisis. Very quickly, things on the ground turned around. The Israelis were not at an existential threat. The Egyptians crossed the canal, but then they stopped. And so for the next several weeks, there was really no further nuclear shadow, as I would call it, over this conflict. I didn't sense it anyway. Nobody was making threats or seeming to be alarmed about that. And so the war is finally brought to an end on October 22nd with a US-Soviet negotiated agreement that is passed by the United Nations for a ceasefire in place on the lines of October 22nd. And Kissinger goes back to the United States via Israel, stops to talk to the Israelis, and gives them a little bit of a green light. If you need a few more hours to kind of clean up the battlefield and maybe advance a little bit, it's not going to be a big problem for us. Gets back and discovers that they have raced forward, cutting off the Egyptian Third Army, and the Egyptians and the Russians are going nuts because they think the United States has just violated the terms of the agreement that they had just helped negotiate, which they had. And so over the next day or so, the Egyptians asked for a joint US-Soviet force to intervene to separate the Israeli and Egyptian forces and get them back to where they should have been at the ceasefire. And the United States says, no, we're not going to do a joint operation with the Russians. The Russians say, if you don't do it with us, we'll do it alone. And with military means if necessary. And at that point, Nixon is out of it. He is both politically out of it. He's deep into the weeds of Watergate and all the dangers that reflected for him. People were resigning because of Watergate. And the night this came to a head, he was drunk. I'm 99% sure that was the reason he wasn't able to come to the NSC meeting, where Kissinger said, we have to send a message to the Russians who are threatening unilateral military intervention that we will react to that. So he ordered, with the support of the Defense Department, but without Nixon's authorization, he ordered a stage 3 nuclear alert. And that's the next moment when all of a sudden a nuclear shadow and maybe a nuclear cloud appears over this crisis. Now, in the Middle East itself, a stage 3 nuclear alert did not mean much. All the forces, American forces in the Mediterranean, in Europe, in Middle East region were already on that level of alert. So in the Middle East, it didn't change much. But worldwide, every other military facility under American control, including all over the United States, was alerted to raise the ante, to call back reservists, to get ready for possible military deployments. And it was in the United States that people woke up the next morning and thought, oh my God, this is like the Cuban Missile Crisis all over again. So on that day, there was a lot of diplomacy, and the Russians made it clear finally to Kissinger that they weren't planning to send any troops, that wasn't going to happen. So fairly quickly, things kind of wound down. And of course, a lot of people thought the whole nuclear alert was meant to divert attention from Watergate, which I don't actually think it was, but it certainly had some effect of that sort. And so the last little bit of this that I remember was that as we were kind of winding down from this, the morning of maybe the 25th, we picked up a fragment of intelligence. And this is the danger of, intercepting other people's communications, but not completely. And it was from the foreign ministry in Moscow to the embassy in Cairo. And it said, Soviet troops arriving 3 p.m. this afternoon. And we all got this at the same time. Kissinger read it. He said, oh my God, they decided to send their troops. And he said, if they're sending troops to the Middle East, we have to send troops as well. And he turned to me and to a State Department colleague, and he said, you guys figure out where we send troops, but not to Israel and not to Egypt. This is no longer a regional issue, it's a US-Soviet issue. But if they're putting troops in to the region, we have to do the same. And then he walked out. And I remember thinking, where the heck, Turkey, Cyprus, Iran, Jordan wouldn't take troops in the midst. So, but anyway, you try to go through the list. There's not a very good list right then. About half an hour later, he came back and said, forget it. Said, misunderstanding. I just talked to the Soviet ambassador. These are the 30 military observers that I agreed to when I was in Moscow 3 days ago that were supposed to go from the Russian side and our side to observe the truce. And that's all it is. So just relax. And that was just about the end of the concern about nuclear weapons in that crisis. And then, of course, the diplomatic arena opened up and things changed fairly dramatically. But there were a couple of moments in that crisis where you realize this isn't the Cuban Missile Crisis. It's not that dangerous, but it wouldn't take very much to have pushed it up to that level.
Wow. So what's your bottom line on whether and how this famed thing called nuclear deterrence actually operated during the 1973 war?
Well, obviously, it didn't prevent the simultaneous Egyptian-Syrian attack. And I think they correctly judged that if they didn't threaten Israel's existential existence by their attack, and that is if they limited their attack to the occupied territories, Israel would not resort to a nuclear response. And they were right about that. But I think that if they had gone further, it would have gotten much more dangerous. Now, we know from the Syrian side that their tank commanders had been given orders to advance as quickly as they could to the border and then stop, not to cross the border on into Israel. So we've never had an explanation of why, but you don't have to be a rocket scientist to realize that for them, it would get much more risky if they crossed the border. On the Egyptian side, initially, Sadat crossed the canal and didn't move. And then under pressure from the Syrians and under pressure from some of his own military, he, on about the 4th, 5th day of the war, he started moving tank divisions out into the middle of the Sinai, and they got to the so-called Mitla Pass, which is just some hills that give a little bit of strategic protection on both sides. And he stopped at that point. And then the Israelis counterattacked and pushed them back. Now, years later, after Egypt and Israel had made peace, Sadat went to Israel once and agreed to meet with some of the generals who had been his opponents during the 1973 war. And I would love to know what really went on in that discussion. But the one part that has been reported is that one of the Israeli generals said, "Why did you stop in the middle of Sinai? It was pretty much open for you up to the border, and you could have kept on going. Why didn't you?" And Sadat sort of smilingly said, "Oh, perhaps you didn't know Israel had nuclear weapons." And then he laughed. So I think what he was saying is we knew that there was a point at which this would become extremely dangerous if we approached the border and even crossed it. And I think the Syrians, by their orders to their tank commanders, were saying the same thing. So, Israel also conventionally had very strong countermeasures that they could take. But I think the nuclear weapon made a difference in terms of Egypt's strategic planning. But I don't think they ever had any illusion they could defeat Israel. I think what they didn't worry about is that in the initial attack, which was into their occupied territory, Israel would not risk using this taboo kind of weapon against them in their own territory.
Yeah, and actually, as you have written and researched intensively, it seems much more likely that the intention of Sadat was to restart real peace negotiations, rather than to vanquish Israel. So thank you. Wow. You were right there in the White House, and during the 1973 war, you were the lead Middle East person sitting at Henry Kissinger's side. I don't know.
Well, not very often.
Still don't know how I feel about that, but anyway, I'm going to hand back to Amelle, and she's got some questions that the two of us can just bat between us as we want.
Yeah, so to start us off, can you go into the other broader effects that Israel's nuclear arsenal has had on American policymaking?
Why don't you take that, Helena?
Okay, so go back to the French guy who was the author of the French nuclear program, and François Perrin, and he said that it's important to have nuclear weapons to increase our bargaining power with Washington. And I think that passed on over to Shimon Peres and the people who were designing the Israeli nuclear weapons program. And in particular, you can see, including in Bill's books and elsewhere, how it was kind of like, oh, the Israelis would say, you've got to give us more and more conventional weapons, because otherwise, we might be forced to use what without mentioning it. And wouldn't you say that that's been a factor, Bill?
Yes, I mean, you can see, and there's a document that I think will be posted that's called the National Security Study Memorandum 40, which I've just recently discovered has been declassified. It was put together in 1970, primarily by the State Department and Defense Department. And the Defense Department, particularly in its contribution to the study, says that the Israelis use this threat of going nuclear to get us to give them more conventional weapons. But we don't need to always say yes. We still have, agency. But he acknowledges that this is part of the dialogue. It's kind of implicit, maybe sometimes more explicit, sometimes less so. But it is clearly on people's mind that, at what point, if the Israelis say, well, if you don't give us Phantom jets, of course, we're going to have to take other measures or something like that. Again, I can't say that I was ever in a setting where I heard explicitly that clear a discussion of the trade-off. And particularly in the Carter period, none of that really came up, which was the other time I was in government. But yes, I think there's always been some understanding that if you keep Israel well supplied with conventional weapons, they can continue with this relatively non-public nuclear capability. They won't talk about it, they won't flaunt it, they won't test it.
And within the USG, which branches have been more concerned by Israel's nuclear weapons state status and which are not so concerned?
Well, actually, I think the Defense Department at various times has been more concerned than the State Department. State Department seemed to sort of accept that we'd found a kind of diplomatic trade-off. They don't flaunt the weapons, we don't talk about them, and we can live with that. And the Arabs had all kind of accepted that they didn't like it, but they didn't want to call attention to the fact that Israel had nuclear weapons and they didn't. It was kind of embarrassing to them after all that they couldn't do much about it. So you do see some differences. The real difference, of course, was that nobody, with very few exceptions in Congress, wanted to tackle this kind of issue at all. And so even those who in principle were in favor of kind of the non-proliferation treaty, who were trying desperately to keep Iraq or Iran from getting nuclear weapons, they wouldn't say, well, if we're going to be consistent, we need to say that all countries who are not, who don't have, who should sign on to the non-proliferation treaty and obey the rules of that. But because that would force them to take a stand on the Israeli program, even though it wasn't public, everybody sort of knew they had a capability. Congress has been very weak on that, on the Israeli nuclear capability, whereas on the prospect of Iraq getting nuclear weapons or Iran getting nuclear weapons, Congress is 90–95% in favor of putting pressure on them.
And you sort of spoke to this, but what effect has Israel's blatant disregard of the NPT had on the global non-proliferation effort?
Well, I can jump in here because, I mean, I've seen the way, obviously, that, well, so I'll back up a little bit because we have not really discussed the structure of the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty enough on this series thus far. Basically, it was adopted in 1968 and then came into force in 1972, and it divided the world into the world's nations into two baskets. There were the recognized nuclear weapons states, and then there were the rest. So the recognized nuclear weapons states had certain obligations under the treaty, including to give kind of nuclear expertise for peaceful purposes to other countries under strict safeguards, which would be operated by the International Atomic Energy Agency, the IAEA. And the non-weapon states had to commit to not trying to acquire or produce or develop nuclear weapons, and to be subject to, in their like non-weapons nuclear energy or nuclear medical programs, to be subject to IAEA inspections. So that's what Richard Falk has described as nuclear apartheid. And it's kind of entrenched by the fact that the 5 recognized nuclear weapon states, the 5 nuclear weapon states that are recognized as such within the NPT are the US, China, Russia, France, and Britain, which happen to be, by an amazing coincidence, the 5 veto-wielding permanent members of the Security Council. So that's why Richard Falk calls it, nuclear apartheid. So if Israel was to join the NPT, it would have to either join as a nuclear weapons state or as a nuclear non-weapon state. So it didn't want to make that choice. It didn't want to declare itself. And that's why it has always stood outside the NPT. There was, I think in the late 80s, at some point, there was a big to-do about whether Israel should be allowed into the IAEA, which is kind of the operational part of verifying the NPT. And Israel was allowed into the IAEA at US insistence. But other nations in the world have seen, Israel's just, blatant disregard of the NPT, and it has really undermined the value of the NPT, which is questionable anyway because of the apartheid aspects of it. But if you look at, so the other three NPT scofflaw nations are India and Pakistan, each of which demonstrated its nuclear weapons capability, I want to say in 1999 or in 2000, and North Korea. So, there's a lot of discussion and concern about those three countries having, undeclared nuclear weapons capabilities in the media all over the United States. But nobody in the media ever wants to talk about Israel, and that has massive consequences. I mean, the sheer hypocrisy when people are saying, oh, the Iranians have so many centrifuges and they're producing, so much enriched uranium at such and such a level of enrichment. And my goodness, the sanctions, the misery that Congress and the president, the successive presidents have visited on the people of Iran because of these allegations. And nobody ever mentions Israel's nuclear, well-established nuclear weapons capability. That's one thing. The other is, while I'm talking about kind of the public discourse in this country, is just that rhetorical move of sort of downplaying the very special, the especially disastrous and ecocidal nature of nuclear weapons by conflating them with other weapons into this bigger basket called weapons of mass destruction. So that makes it seem as though Syria or Iraq having chemical weapons is just as serious as Israel having nuclear weapons. It's not, I mean, I think we need to pick out and emphasize the specialness of nuclear weapons and their destructive power.
Thank you. I don't know if you want to add anything, Bill, or I can move on to.
All right. That's fine.
Well, so what can we do to strengthen the campaign to bring Israel's nuclear arsenal under, a full effective monitoring and for Israel to join the TPNW's nuclear disarmament process?
Bill, it's your turn.
Well, I think in present circumstances, there's frankly not much hope. You don't have any constituency for that in Israel itself. There's no peace effort going on to reconcile Israel with its remaining adversaries in the region. And there's Iran is still being treated as a country that may or may not have nuclear ambitions of its own. I tend to think they're not all that close, but they certainly have a capability, and they have a scientific community that could help produce weapons without too much delay. So there's a whole regional context that has to be looked at. And right now in the Middle East, there's just no incentive to explore any of the, and you really have to think of this as a regional phenomena, because if Iran were to go nuclear, you can imagine Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Egypt, all also wanting to develop nuclear capabilities. It could get very messy very quickly. And in that context, you would need to think about, is there a regional framework for unwinding this rush toward nuclearization of the Middle East? And that would have to include Israel. I don't know what the Israelis would be prepared to do. At some point when this was being discussed in the past, they said that they would consider the possibility of capping whatever their capabilities were, and to not, enhancing them and allowing inspections and decommissioning them so they weren't on active alert if other nuclear prone countries would also agree not to develop them and so forth. But I haven't heard that in decades from any Israeli but that was the closest I ever heard to an Israeli expressed interest in a regional framework in which they and the others would start thinking about how do you lower the temperature and reduce the danger of these terrible weapons.
Yeah, I think I would take a little bit of a different tack. I mean, you know, we're talking primarily about what civil society activists here in the US and other NATO countries might do. So I think the first thing is we should urge a speedy return to the JCPOA, which is the, joint, help me out, people. You know, it's the nuclear deal with Iran, okay? Which Israel has been trying to stymie. And why? Because it likes the tensions to be high. It likes to, you know, punish the Iranians. And to some extent now the Saudis are actively working in this country to keep us from reinstating the JCPOA. So that's one thing we can do. Another is that we need to talk about Israel's nuclear weapons at every opportunity, and not to keep the focus on, you know, will Iran do this? Will Iran do that? Iran, you know, oh, they've enriched to this degree. Oh no, they're 5 months away. I mean, all this focus on Iran's possible capabilities, which a large number of those questions would be answered if the JCPOA were reinstated, because, you know, you would have a much better sanctions regime. I mean, not sanctions, I mean inspections regime in Iran that would answer these questions, which we had with the JCPOA when it existed before. But I don't think that Americans who are concerned about nuclear weapons should be focusing on Iran more than we focus on Israel, because Israel has these things, just as we have these things. So, you know, we need to put pressure on our members of Congress to support the kind of great initiatives that Delegate Eleanor Holmes Norton has been pioneering for 29 years now, since she's had this resolution to stop funding the nuclear weapons, to start our nuclear weapons, to draw down the US nuclear arsenal, and to redirect those funds into green infrastructure in this country and human needs in this country. So, you know, we need to be anti-nuclear in our own context and anti-nuclear in the Israeli context, in every other context, but especially because, you know, it is our tax dollars that go to support both of those nuclear programs. I think, you know, we have a special responsibility for the insecurity and misery that they cause.
Well, thank you both so much. I'm conscious of time, so I think we should move on to the Q&A. So if anyone has questions, please put them in the Q&A box. But to start us, we have one from our board member, Rick Sterling, from the chat. So any comments about this missile which landed near Dimona in April 2021? Was that a signal from Syria and maybe Iran?
Gosh, it's hard.
Know.
It's hard to say. What do you think, Bill?
Well, it is a tempting target if anybody can reach it, but you know, I don't know the specifics. But obviously, in any future military conflict that Israel is engaged in with Syria or with Iran or with, I don't know who else it could be, Dimona is a target, and it's one that presumably they have lots of defenses for, but it does stand out as an obvious target.
Amelle, I'm seeing that Ray McGovern has raised his hand. So, oh, and now you've been enabled, Ray. How do we get him in?
I think he's in. There we go.
Oh, hi. Ray McGovern
Okay.
was one of our great speakers, actually at the second session that we had in this series. So welcome back.
Thank you. This has been fascinating. Helena, I've heard you before. Bill, I've not heard you talk so frankly about deep, dark secrets. And one of my questions is this. At the National Defense University, which you will recall well, in August of 1982, Menachem Begin said, let it all out. He told those students, in June 1967, we had a choice. The Egyptian army concentrations in the Sinai approaches do not prove that Nasser was really about to attack us. We must be honest with ourselves. We decided to attack him, end quote. Now, I always thought that was highly interesting, but I still had a lot of questions. And what you have told us now about those reconnaissance flights in May of 1967, and the fact that not only the Egyptians, but the Syrians and the others probably knew that Israel was about to get a nuclear weapon, well, that certainly throws a whole new light on these things. And, you know, would you comment on that, Bill? Do you think that Begin's statement sort of stands by itself, or do you think it needs a real corollary here by this information that it was an Israeli, well, in those days, we didn't call it a war of choice, but a war of choice, a preemptive strike, lest the Egyptians get it into their head to try to attack Dimona. What do you think, Bill?
I think that it is true that the Israelis, including people like Begin, did not think that the Egyptians were going to launch a full-fledged offensive. They had mobilized, they sent troops into Sinai, but those troops had then dug in. And I think there were two concerns at that point on the part of the Israelis. Should they then fully mobilize on the off chance that those Egyptian and Syrian troops would get activated and there would be a conventional war that would be started? And how long could they remain mobilized at full strength? Because Israel has a reserve army that gets called up, and once you call them up, they can sit there for several weeks, but not necessarily months and months. So they've always been a little reluctant to do full-scale mobilization unless they thought war was imminent or they were about to launch one. And they hadn't yet fully mobilized. And then the other thing, and this is about Dimona, is even if they don't attack us with conventional weapons, which we're pretty sure we can handle, what if they do hit Dimona? I mean, first, it could set back our nuclear program, which has just come to fruition, and it could spill a lot of radioactivity around if it were inaccurate. And there had been 5 overflights in a period of several days in May. So I think it was the combination of we can't just sit here for weeks, which is what the Americans want us to do, to find a diplomatic solution. And any day, the Egyptians could decide to carry out an airstrike, not necessarily a ground attack, but an airstrike. And I think it was the combination of those two that led the military people, not so much Eshkol, who was prime minister, but the military to say, we've got to go, and we've got to go fast. And that was what Meyer Amit told Dick Helms on June 2nd. He said, I think it's a matter of days. And he said, I'm going back and I'm going to recommend that we preempt because we can't wait any longer.
Let me, am I still audible?
Yep.
Yeah, okay. Thanks, Bill. That's really interesting. I was a Soviet specialist in those days, and I recall the furor that occurred when we learned of that message from the Russians to their embassy in Cairo, That was a very delicate moment. My question has to do with this.
So hang on, Ray, you're
At this,
talking about 1973?
no,
That
I'm
was
talking
73.
about yeah, right, 73. I'm sorry. Yeah, thank you,
Yeah.
Helena. Earlier on, let me see. I guess when I'm talking about now 1967, in those days and in 73, Dick Helms was not in charge of the CIA on these matters. A fellow named James Jesus Angleton was. Yeah. He was the source of all kinds of mischief. Among other things, he would never believe me that the Russians really hated the Chinese in those days. Okay, they were all communists, right? But that's a side. What I'm interested in is, were you at the NSC and Kissinger and others, were you sure that that you were not being undercut, or that the Israelis were not taking Angleton more seriously than they were taking you?
Well, first of all, I was pretty junior and didn't. I never met Angleton. I didn't have any relationship with him. So I have no direct knowledge. I have heard subsequently that Angleton was suspected by many of his own colleagues of not being trustworthy. Some even think he was on the Israeli payroll. He was a very suspicious character. He suspected everybody of being a Soviet agent, everybody he disagreed with. So yeah, I think he was problematic, but it was just beyond my radar screen at that time. I didn't know. And if anybody was worried about it, it would have been Kissinger, and he may or may not have gotten into the weeds on that one and tried to figure it out. I just don't know what Helms thought about Angleton. He must have had ambivalent feelings about him, because he was a pretty smart guy after all.
Yeah, he was a smart guy, but Helms couldn't get rid of him. It took Bill Colby to get rid of him, and you know what happened. You know what happened to Bill Colby.
Yeah.
Let me. I don't want to wear out my welcome here. I have one more question.
I think
Okay.
we you know, it's getting on here, Ray, but we can talk about this a little bit later. There's one more question, Amelle, if you could ask that one.
Yeah, so this comes from Richard Ox. Does the Liberty ship have anything to do with these events?
Well, the Liberty was an American surveillance ship that was off the coast of Israel, and it was monitoring communications throughout the region, I gather. I mean, I don't have too much firsthand information about this, but a lot of people have written what they know. And we do know that the Israelis attacked the ship and basically put it out of action. And the question has always been why. Was it a mistake? Did they think it was an Egyptian ship that was fair game once the war had started? Or did they know it was an American ship and they attacked it deliberately? And honestly, I don't know the answer to that completely. I do think there's pretty good evidence that the Israelis had seen the American flag on the ship. They may have thought it was a false flag, but the ship did not resemble any known Egyptian ship. And if there was a reason for attacking it, some people have said that it had picked up information that the Israelis were planning an offensive to take the Golan Heights, which they hadn't yet started to do as of June 10th or whichever day this happened on. And that, not that I think we would have necessarily tried to stop them. I mean, Syria was not exactly a popular country in the United States then, but for whatever reason, the ship was attacked. And of course, I think 40 some odd Americans lost their lives in that. And you still see the survivors of the Liberty, demonstrating down at the Vietnam Memorial and handing out literature and so forth. But when the issue came up in the Johnson administration, just immediately after it happened, it was discussed in the cabinet, and whatever intelligence we had was discussed. And there were people in intelligence and in the State Department who said the Israelis did this deliberately so that we would not know what they were doing. And we recommend that you have a full-fledged naval inquiry that goes fully into this once the war is over. We need to find out what happened. And Johnson said, we're not going to do that. So Johnson put a stop to the investigation. Don't ask me why, but I mentioned before his political sympathies were very much with the Israelis.
Well, thank you so much. I'm afraid we're going to have to cut it off here. I see we've gone beyond the 75-minute mark, but it's been so fascinating. So my huge thanks to Bill and to Amelle. It's been really a great evening, and thank you to Ray McGovern for his cameo appearance with us toward the end there. I do have a couple of quick notes before we finally wrap this up. First, please remember that Just World Educational is completely reliant on grassroots support to keep our cutting edge programming going. So if you haven't donated to us recently, please rush as fast as you can to the donate button on our website, www.justworldeducational.org, where you can learn how to give to us securely, whether online or with a check through the mail. Second, please know that all the records of the conversations in this series are being made available in as timely a fashion as possible via this link on our website or this one. And we're also starting to build all these multimedia records into a new online learning hub on our website on the topic of the urgency of a nuclear weapons ban, which will join the collection of other great online learning hubs that we have there. Especially, I want to pay attention to the one, our recent one on the Ukraine crisis. I urge you to check out all the great online learning hubs we have at the resources tab on our website. Third, we've decided to do something else as well with all of this material on banning nukes, and that is to use it as the basis for a new, more structured online curriculum that we'll be building with the working title of Nuclear Realities 101. The goal of this curriculum is to present the kinds of essential materials that everyone who was not a sentient adult at the time of the end of the Cold War, let us say everyone who is under 45 or under 50 years old today, and perhaps some people even older than that, should become familiar with nowadays as we look more closely at the nuclear realities that have undergirded the world system all along, ever since 1945, and including during the last 30 years of US unipolarity. If you'd like to help us design and implement our curriculum project, please let us know. What do you think people in our target audience need to know? And what's the best way for us to present these information resources to them? Fourth, did I mention that all this work takes resources, and we'd love it if you could support us. So head off to our donate button. Finally, I want to wish goodbye and real thanks to Amelle Zeroug, who's played a fabulous role today and in all of our sessions. And big thanks to Bill Quandt. I have no need to say goodbye to you, Bill, since I'll be meeting you in the dining room for a nightcap once we're done here. Everybody else, please be sure to join us on Saturday and stay safe till then. Thanks, Bill. Thanks, Amelle. Bye.
Bye-bye.